Welcome, everyone, to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a really fascinating and honestly, a deeply provocative book by author Karma Nayak. It's called Silent Tragedy, or Maun Tragedy. And look, this text completely challenges everything we think we know about hunger, poverty, and systemic power in India. It's definitely not your standard collection of historical facts. Nayak frames this as a full-blown manifesto for what he calls a digital Ulgulan, basically a digital revolution. So today, we're going to neutrally unpack the author's bold claims about this massive, invisible crisis that he says is operating right under our noses. Let's dive in. Nayak immediately hooks you by contrasting two totally different realities of hunger. On one hand, you've got these highly publicized political hunger strikes, right? The text mentions high-profile figures like Sonam Wangchuk or Anna Hazare at Ramlila Maidan. Now, those events command wall-to-wall media coverage, massive political debates, and global attention. But on the flip side, Nayak points to something completely different, the totally ignored forced starvation of millions in marginalized areas. He's really challenging us to look at the everyday, silent starvation that people endure, not to make a political point, but just out of sheer helplessness. He argues that society has essentially built what he calls a hierarchy of hunger. It's a system where the struggles of places like his own village of Hiranagpur are just completely erased from the mainstream narrative. I mean, think about it. Why does the hunger of a politician become this grand, televised spectacle, while the everyday starvation of a child just becomes a mere statistic on a government spreadsheet? The book suggests this is no accident. It's the reflection of a system that only amplifies the voices of those who already hold power. So, according to the author, this hunger crisis isn't just some modern glitch. It's actually a systemic failure that has been evolving over decades. Let's trace the historical timeline Nayak lays out, starting from independence all the way up to 2026. The book outlines this really chronological failure. It argues that while 1947 brought political independence, it still left millions of people with empty plates. Then, we get to the Green Revolution in the 1960s, and while that's historically celebrated for filling government warehouses with grain, Nayak claims it actually replaced traditional, resilient agriculture with a system heavily dependent on chemicals. And this specific historical trajectory, he argues, leads us straight into a severe crisis where by 2025, India finds itself struggling right near the bottom of global hunger rankings. Now here is where it gets really interesting. Nayak claims a massive hidden cost of the Green Revolution was the loss of traditional, deeply nutritious millets, crops like kodo, kudki, and ragi. Losing those created a lasting nutritional famine because the focus shifted to mass-producing just a few high-yield, chemically dependent crops. We effectively erased the diverse, drought-resistant foods that generations had relied on. So we end up with this wild paradox. We gained calories, sure, but we lost vital micronutrients. The population is left internally hollowed out even though the green silos are full. And that paradox creates what the author terms the double burden. Today, the country faces two wild extremes. In rural and marginalized populations, you see severe undernourishment and stunted growth. But meanwhile, urban populations are facing an epidemic of obesity and non-communicable diseases, things like diabetes and heart disease, driven entirely by cheap, processed foods. The author is very clear here. This obesity isn't a sign of wealth. It's just a different form of malnutrition caused by a flawed food system, where real, nutritious food is treated like a luxury. Okay, so how does the system handle the reality of all this malnutrition? Well, that brings us to one of the absolute most provocative concepts in the entire book. Nayak introduces us to the graveyard of data. He defines this as the systemic and deliberate administrative erasure of starvation deaths. Basically, when a person dies because they literally did not have enough to eat, the system doesn't record hunger as the cause. Instead, that true cause of death is statistically erased. It gets reclassified in official records as a medical disease, and Nayak argues that this exact mechanism is how the administration completely dodges true accountability. He breaks down this manipulation of data as a deliberate three-step process. Step 1, a tragic starvation death occurs. Step 2, a clerk or a doctor who's often under intense pressure logs the cause of death as anemia or pneumonia or organ failure. And step 3, systemic accountability is completely erased. By simply swapping out a word on a digital form, a profound human tragedy is converted into a statistical error. It just neatly hides the failure of the system to feed its own people. But despite all these administrative erasures, global metrics still tell a pretty stark story. The text cites the 2025 Global Hunger Index, which ranks India 102nd out of 123 countries, with a score of 25.8. That officially categorizes the hunger level as serious. For Nayak, this number is just undeniable proof that despite all the mainstream narratives of economic growth, the foundational crisis of hunger is still deeply, deeply entrenched. So, if the data is so clear, why do these failures keep happening? Well, Nayak points to a historical power structure that he says has been pulling the strings for a very long time. He posits that there is a 3,000-year-old syndicate, a ruling elite that represents just 10% of the population, but completely controls the 90% marginalized majority. And I love the modern metaphor he uses here. He describes this elite as the software of the system. Whether it was colonial rule back in the day or democratic institutions right now, this 10% has always known exactly how to hack the administrative and social software to keep all the power consolidated right at the top. To back this up, the author heavily references a famous warning from the architect of the Indian Constitution himself, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar warned that even the absolute best constitution will prove to be bad if the people implementing it are bad. Nayak uses this exact quote to analyze how supposedly neutral institutional frameworks, like the judiciary, election commissions, or the media, can be totally weaponized by the syndicate if the wrong people are at the helm. The book makes the case that during the transfer of power in 1947, the Constitution inadvertently handed executive power right back to this exact same oppressive syndicate. And that created a massive, painful gap between the written constitutional dream, which obviously promises the right to life and equality for all, and the harsh reality on the ground, where the 90% face systemic starvation and total powerlessness. The institutions designed to protect the vulnerable were essentially hijacked. Now, to prove this isn't just academic theory, the author takes us right to the front lines of the crisis. He shares the reality of his own life in the village of Hiranagpur. Nayak shares this incredibly sobering personal reality. He literally wrote this book on a diet of just salt and rice. Beside him was his 80% disabled brother Vijay, who was forced to wait months for a meager 1,000 rupee pension. Surviving on just salt and rice made Nayak realize something crucial. Poverty isn't just bad luck. He states it is a deliberate policy of the syndicate. And honestly, this lived reality anchors the whole text. It turns a systemic critique into a really profound human struggle. So how do we fix a system this broken? As a solution to crashing the suppressive systemic software, the author proposes a modern movement he calls the digital Ulgulan. Ulgulan is a term historically tied to tribal rebellion, but Nayak is bringing it straight into the 21st century. He argues that the fight is no longer just happening in physical fields. It has to be fought in the realm of ideas, data, and digital consciousness. And he lays out a very clear manifesto for this revolution, serving as a direct call to action for the 90% majority. The goals? Fight for your rights. Reclaim hunger as a systemic crime rather than just misfortune. And launch an intellectual revolution to finally crash the syndicate's code. To fuel this digital consciousness, Nayak urges the public to dive into his extensive research. Specifically, he points to his 18 books, including a key text called Kalki 2026, as the exact intellectual tools needed for this mass awakening. So, as we wrap up our explainer of Karma Nayak's framework today, we are left with a pretty massive question to ponder. As we move closer to the future he outlines in 2026, will this proposed digital Ulgulan actually succeed? Will an intellectual awakening of the 90% finally crash this 3,000-year-old code of systemic inequality? Or will the syndicate software simply adapt and survive like it always has? It's a powerful thought to leave you with. Thanks so much for joining me, and remember to always keep questioning the data around you.